Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the Normal and Heroic raid guide for the Butcher. And this is arguably the second boss in the zone, although you can optionally choose any of the three here. He's probably the second easiest, so we'll do him next. And he's mechanically pretty simple. You basically need to deal with the Cleave mechanic, which targets the largest group of players within melee range of him normally. So by rotating the sizes of two differing melee groups, you can alternate the cleave attacks on these two groups as appropriate. So with that, let's get into the specifics and figure out how to do the Butcher. So as mentioned, Cleave is cast very frequently. It's the entire mechanic really of this fight. And it is cast on the largest clump of players that are within melee range most of the time. So you can see the raid markers around the boss kind of indicate our positioning. We have a triangle set up. So blue in the front is where the tanks are stacked. And then purple in the back right where I am, and green in the back left of him where the other melee group is. Now to distribute Cleave, you have to adjust the number of players that are within each of the melee groups frequently, because he always targets the group with the largest number of players. If you have equal distribution, say 5 and 5 in both, then it's random and you cannot reliably avoid cleaves that you want to avoid. When he cleaves you, you'll get a stack of Gushing Wounds, which is a stacking dot. Goes up very quickly and the damage is pretty heavy. When this reaches 5 stacks, however, you will die instantly. So the goal is to prevent any of the melee players soaking Cleave from reaching 5 stacks at any point, while lowering the damage as much as possible. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's not a minimum requirement of players that need to be stacked. Because of this, the Cleave attack itself, the initial hit, splits its damage with the number of players that are targeted by it. So you simply can't just have, 2 people soak it up each time or something like that. You always have to have enough people that the actual Cleave hit itself will not kill you. Now, in normal, the damage from Cleave itself is not that significant, so you can actually have fairly few people in melee range depending on your raid makeup. But you obviously need to adjust based on how many melee you have on your roster. Now, composing your melee groups is fairly simple, but you should plan ahead a little bit. The first thing to do is to just count up the number of melee DPS excluding your tanks and evenly distribute them between the two groups. So if you have an even number of melee, obviously it's very simple. If you have an odd number, then one of the groups will have 1 extra melee DPS. However, beyond that, you also need to make sure that you have a range DPS that is capable of running in and out to adjust for the numbers and therefore manage the Cleave itself. Because you do not want to force one of your melee DPS to have to run out of a group so that you can manage the Cleave properly. You just lose a ton of DPS. So there are 2 basic methods to do this with as few people as possible, depending on whether you have an even or an odd number of melee DPS. So if your raid has an even number of melee DPS, Group A has half the melee DPS plus 1 ranged player, and Group B has the same. And then both of your ranged players need to alternate. So at the beginning of the fight, for example, you'll have Group A's ranged player stacked up with their group, and Group B's ranged player will be out. Then once Group A's ranged player has 3 stacks of Gushing Wounds, that player moves out, and Group B's ranged player moves in. From that point forward, you can just keep alternating. The exception is after the knockback, which I'll talk about in a moment, where the stacks will reset. But otherwise, you just alternate. As one range goes out, the other one goes in, and vice versa. Now, if your raid has odd number of melee, then obviously when you split them up, you have 1 extra melee. So in this example, Group A has the 1 extra melee. So for our raid, that was 4 melee in Group A and 3 melee in Group B. Therefore, to have the fewest number of players as required within the cleaves, you then add 2 ranged players to Group B only. So instead of evenly distributing your ranged to each group, instead you can add them both to Group B in this scenario. And that means that you still only add the 2 extra ranged players, the minimum required, beyond the total number of melee DPS. And then the same basic idea applies here. Your ranged players will start either inside or out, it doesn't really matter, at the beginning of the fight. And then they will alternate based on having 3 gushing wounds. They'll go out, and then they'll come back in once the wounds drop. So in our raid, we had our warlocks performing this duty. And you'll also notice that I'm a healer, obviously, but I'm still in melee range, and this was to test, whether healing from inside melee was better or not. It's hard to say. Now, throughout the fight, when the Butcher reaches 100 energy, full energy, he will use Bounding Cleave. And this will cause him to kind of wind up an attack where he knocks everybody back. He gets really angry, and then he leaps toward a ranged clump of players. So this is the one time that he will cleave anybody that's not in melee range. And in fact, he will prefer to target players at range. So if you have anybody out of melee range, he will jump to those people. Otherwise, the same rules apply. He will jump to the largest clump of players, but this time those that are out of melee range. So there you can see him doing it there. So there are a few ways to deal with this, but the simplest method is just to either decide how many of your range you want to stack up for it, to distribute the actual initial cleave hit, or whether you want fewer people to get hit but for more initial damage, but therefore have lower dot damage from the single stack of gushing wounds. So it doesn't really matter either way. We're doing this method here where we have basically all our range stay stacked up for it to reduce the cleave damage. The theory being that it may be required on higher difficulties, but I don't think it makes much difference. You can probably just have maybe 4 or 5, depending on your raid makeup, people stacked up for it, and then have everyone else just spread around the boss. So Bounding Cleave is pretty simple. The good thing about Bounding Cleave is that it will actually give you breathing room. So if you're struggling with the healing, particularly if you're lower geared, the healing can be quite tough early on in this fight. And Bounding Cleave gives you breathing room for your healers to regen mana as well as heal up the melee clumps that are taking most of the damage. So watch his energy closely to see when he's about to do it. So the final thing to discuss is tanking. And it's not too complicated, but there is a lot of potential spike damage on the tanks. The first and most important rule for tanking is to ensure that both tanks are stacked up on top of one another very tightly at all times. The reason for this is the heavy-handed ability, which essentially the Butcher has up constantly, and it will cause all of his attacks to duplicate themselves onto a nearby melee target near his primary tank target. So if your tanks are not stacked up, instead he will duplicate his attacks on the single tank target. So if your tanks are not stacked for even a brief moment, your initial tank can just get destroyed. It's particularly important to note on the pull, where if the tanks don't run in simultaneously, the first tank can get spiked quite a bit. Other than that, he has a swap mechanic from the Cleaver / the Tenderizer abilities. So the idea here is that if you dodge the Cleaver, if you use your avoidance, you will not get this stack of Tenderizer. But if you don't avoid it, you do get stacks of Tenderizer. And you'll want to change tanks around every 3 or 4 stacks, depending on your healing and mitigation abilities. So that's pretty much it. Make sure you tank him directly in the proper positions so your melee groups aren't chaining cleaves onto the other tanks or the other melee group. But otherwise, just stay stacked up and tanks should be fine. And the Butcher is pretty simple. I think that covers everything. So just practice the healing. Make sure you get your groups associated correctly. Make sure you have 2 people that can handle the in and out for cleave management, because that's essentially the entire mechanic. After that, it's just a DPS and healing test. So, as always, thanks for watching. Good luck, and I'll see you for the next encounter.